Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Delighted to welcome you tonight. My name is Josh Dunn. I'm the director of the Institute of American Civics here at the Baker School of Public Policy and Public Affairs. It's so exciting to see such a healthy audience for our event this evening. So the mission of the Institute of American Civics is to strengthen civic education and participation while reviving thoughtfulness, civility, respect for opposing viewpoints. Our annual Constitution Day lecture is just one expression of that message. We gather annually around Constitution Day. You'll notice it's not September 17th, it's September 18th, but around Constitution Day, when delegates in Philadelphia completed a framework that would channel disagreement into deliberation, ambition into accountability, and diverse communities into a single people under a common charter. This isn't only an anniversary. It's an invitation to revisit our first principles, including limited government, separation of powers, federalism, representation, and the rule of law. So this evening, we're honored to host Yuval Levin, one of today's most thoughtful voices on American constitutionalism and civic renewal. Yuval leads the Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies program at the American Enterprise Institute and serves as the founding editor of the public policy journal National Affairs. This journal offers some of the best commentary on the political and policy challenges our nation faces and how to address them. If you care about our nation and are not reading National Affairs, you should. Previously, you've all served in the White House, focusing on domestic policy under President George W. Bush, and he holds a master's and doctoral degree from the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. His talk this evening will focus on the most recent of his 7 books, American Covenant, How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again. In this book, you'll find a recurring argument that the Constitution is not a machine that just runs by itself, but a framework that relies on the virtues and responsibilities of the people within it. It moderates power, but more importantly, it cultivates habits of cooperation, restraint, and compromise. In our current environment, when those habits seem to be, let me rephrase that. In our current environment, when those habits are in short supply, his message could not be more needed. As an example, just last week, Governor Spencer Cox of Utah, in what he described was the most challenging hours of his life in public service. I think you're all familiar with what he faced last week. He turned to Yuval's words for perspective and encouragement. He said to the press and to the public, "I'll just conclude with the words I share often from a friend and author, Yuval Levin, who was asked if he was optimistic about our country. And he said, 'I'm not optimistic. I hate optimism.' My God, that sounds bad. Optimism is a vice," Yuval said. "It's this idea that good things are just going to happen. In the history of the world, good things have never just happened. I'm not optimistic, but I am hopeful. And hope is the virtue that sits between the vices of optimism and pessimism. Hope is the idea that good things are going to happen because we can make them so." Today, I don't think it takes optimism on my part to believe that you will be hopeful after Yuval Levin's lecture. So please join me in welcoming him to our Constitution Day lecture this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josh. Really wonderful words, and it's an honor to be here. I'm sort of shocked by the size of the crowd. Forgive me. In my experience, this takes either class credit or free food, and so whichever it is, don't tell me. I'm going to assume you're here because you love the Constitution, and maybe you are. It's really wonderful to be here, and I've wanted for a long time to see in person what's happening here at the Baker School and at the Institute, because what's happening here is, whether you know it or not, really a model for something that is happening around the country now in universities that are awakening to their civic responsibilities, that are coming to realize the role that they ought to have where they are. And this place has been showing the way for quite a while on that front. I assume you know how lucky you are to have Josh Dunn here. If you don't, I can tell you, because he's not only a great scholar of the Constitution, but a great leader in this effort. And to have Dean Wanamaker and the rest of the leadership here committed to this, making it happen, it is a model. And everything I've seen here helps me to see why it's a model. I got to spend some time this afternoon with students at the Institute, the Tocqueville scholars, who, the dean told me they're going to make you feel better about America, and that's exactly right. I left with a sense that, you know what, maybe we are in good hands. Maybe this will work out. I think that's what you always want from a conversation with younger Americans, and to find people who are growing into their responsibility as citizens is just a wonderful thing. I want to talk with you about a set of questions that are very much related to that responsibility, a set of questions that are very much related to what we all have to face as citizens in the time we're living in now. I'm going to take up with you a subject that in this moment might seem a little strange. It's how we might think about the Constitution of the United States as a framework for national unity. And I say it might seem strange because unity and cohesion are not really how we normally think about the American Constitution, but also because we're living in a moment of intense division. And it can certainly seem oftentimes like the Constitution is more of a source of that division than a solution to it, because so many of our arguments are about the Constitution. And for both those reasons, we tend to associate the Constitution with some of the problems of this moment. And there are voices on both the left and the right now who see the Constitution fundamentally as an obstacle to a functional politics, as an obstacle to democracy or to what they're trying to achieve. I think they're mistaken. And I want to suggest to you that becoming reacquainted with the Constitution through the lens of national unity is an essential first step toward addressing exactly the problems that we now confront in American life. Seeing the Constitution through that lens of cohesion could help us to see what the stakes are in our public debates, what we stand to gain by recovering the aims and forms of American constitutionalism, and what we stand to lose by showing contempt for the Constitution, as we have been doing for too long now in American life. We're used to thinking that maybe what we stand to lose is something like the rule of law, so that the alternative to constitutionalism is authoritarianism. And there is surely some truth to that at the margins, at the boundaries of our politics. If we genuinely turn against our system with brute force, we do run that risk. And that's not unimaginable. It's less unimaginable than it used to be, so it is a real concern. But it's not the first thing we stand to lose if we treat our Constitution with neglect and with contempt. The first thing we stand to lose is our capacity for cohesion, for holding together, for accommodation, for coalition building, our capacity for unity in the face of our differences. And that's not a prospective danger in 21st century America. That is very much a present reality. We've already been losing our capacity for unity in a polarized and embittered politics. And I want to suggest to you that an important part of the reason for that has been our neglect of the character of our Constitution, our forgetfulness about what it offers us as a set of tools for dealing with a time like this. To see that, we should think about how the Constitution approaches the challenge of unity. That challenge was very much on the minds of the framers of the Constitution. It's the first goal that's put forward in the preamble, to form a more perfect union. It was the explicit subject of the first third or so of the Federalist Papers, an implicit subject certainly of the rest of them. It was constantly on the agenda of the Constitutional Convention. Unity is not the only goal of the Constitution, obviously, but it is a primary goal, and it shows us that there is a way in which the Constitution was intended as an answer to the very sort of question that we now ask ourselves. How can a vast, diverse society hold together and govern itself? Now, it has to be said that if that's right, if unity is a key purpose of our system, that would certainly suggest that our time of division is a time of constitutional failure on some level. And I think that's true, but that it should force us to ask whether what we're looking at here is a failure of constitutional practice or of constitutional design. And so whether a renewal of our politics, a restoration of some of our national cohesion, might not require us to learn something from the Constitution and from its authors, to return in some way to its core purpose, so that we can think again about that question as a practical challenge for us as democratic citizens. whether it should lead us to consider if the Constitution might not be much more like a solution than a problem in a moment like this. To see the Constitution through this lens of the challenge of unity would help us to grasp some of the most important things about it and also some of the most complicated things about this moment that we're living in. So let me briefly sketch out for you just a few ways that we might do that. First of all, to see that the Constitution is concerned with unity is to take notice of a particular understanding of what unity is that could be very helpful to us now in America. It's an idea that is particularly evident in the thinking of James Madison, who was uniquely attuned to the dangers of division and faction. It was for him, above anyone else, that this was the problem to be solved. And Madison outlined a distinct understanding of the nature of political unity that we can start to see by looking at what might seem at first like a kind of contradiction in his thinking. On the one hand, he insisted that disagreement about fundamental questions is just an inherent, unavoidable fact of living in a free society. He put it very bluntly in a lot of places. For example, in Federalist 10, he says, as long as the reason of man continues fallible and he's at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed, period. If we let people think what they want, they're not all going to think the same thing. Anybody who's ever been in a meeting knows that's true. And there's no way to get a lot of people to think the same thing. And yet Madison also insisted that that did not mean that the United States of America could not be a unified society, that we could not be one nation and understand ourselves as belonging together. And so Americans are never going to stop disagreeing, but shouldn't give up on unity. Unity is achievable if we don't expect it to mean unanimity. So then what should we expect it to mean? Embedded in the Constitution, and especially in Madison's approach to it, is, I think, a kind of classical approach to that question that looks to politics as an arena for coming to agreement about common action. And so, simply put, in a free and therefore also diverse society, unity does not mean thinking alike. Unity means acting together. And the difference between thinking alike and acting together is a very important distinction for us to think about in this moment. Now, this is not to say that Americans don't think alike about anything, or that we have no common foundation or shared beliefs. Americans are not strangers to each other. We have some basic principles in common, especially those that are laid out in the Declaration of Independence. But although those widely accepted principles do impose some general boundaries on our life together, there's enormous room for disagreement within those boundaries, and even about those boundaries. And our politics is unavoidably organized around those disagreements and requires us to find ways to act together without entirely resolving those disagreements. But this is a formulation that invites an obvious question. How? How are we supposed to act together when we don't think alike? I would suggest to you that the United States Constitution is intended to be a set of answers to that question. How do we act together when we don't think alike? Almost everything that is mysterious and frustrating to many Americans today about our system of government is a function of its being an answer to that question. And a lot of the dysfunction of our contemporary political culture is a consequence of failures of constitutional practice that stand in the way of putting the Constitution's answers to that question into effect. The answer the Constitution offers is not simple-minded. There are simple-minded ways to answer that question. How are we supposed to act together when we don't think alike? Just take a vote and do whatever the majority wants to do. But that kind of answer, obviously, would endanger minorities. And precisely because we all agree that we are all created equal, that fundamental premise of the Declaration of Independence, and because we've lived a national history that too often has trampled over that truth, Americans know that although majority rule is an absolutely essential principle of legitimacy, it can sometimes also be a principle of despotism and of oppression. Majorities can be oppressive. You can't simply trust them with all the power. Our Constitution looks to help us act together when we don't think alike, while also balancing majority rule and minority and individual rights. That is not a simple task, and for that reason, our system is not a simple system of government. It looks to broaden majorities before empowering them and to restrain majorities while still counting on them. It deals with these kinds of tensions, even contradictions, through a set of dynamic balances that are always in motion, always uncertain, always look like they might fall over. This is its strength, but it's also why the Constitution frustrates us so often. Acting together when we don't think alike requires creating some space for competing approaches to coexist. It requires compelling opposing factions to bargain and negotiate and accommodate. It requires administering the government in steady and predictable ways. It requires enforcing clear boundaries on the power of majorities and public officials. This is the work of federalism and of Congress, of the president and of the courts, respectively. And it all requires a citizenry that is formed in some core Republican virtues by the very experience of acting together when we don't think alike. Looking at the parts of the Constitution through that framework, I think it'd help us understand a little bit about what the Constitution might have to offer us now. To begin with, it could help us to see through a common misunderstanding of American federalism. We tend to view federalism now through the lens of decentralization or subsidiarity. And so we think that the states and the national government are layered over each other, and that federalism encourages us to emphasize the lower layers, the state and local layers. That's a way of thinking about federalism that is useful. It's convenient to communitarians. There's value in it. I certainly resort to it myself, but it's not quite right as a description of what the authors of the Constitution were trying to do. It would be better to think of federalism as describing parallel governments, not layered governments. That they're separate is what really matters about federalism, and the imperative of unity is the reason why. American federalism is intended in part to reduce the number and scope of political controversies that have to be resolved uniformly at the national level. And in that way, it's intended to lower the temperature of our national politics a little bit. Federalism emerged as a compromise at the Constitutional Convention between partisans of a centralized national state who wanted one nation with one government governing the people directly, in which the states might be something like administrative districts, like the counties are in our states now, and other people who thought of the new system as a kind of confederation among the states, something more like the European Union, where the state governments govern the people directly, and the national government exists to resolve problems between the states, problems in common. The convention was not able to reach agreement on which of these should be its way forward, and instead it worked its way toward a kind of novel idea. The state governments and the national government would both govern the people directly, but with regard to different subjects. They explicitly rejected a layered approach in favor of a parallel approach, so that broadly speaking, the federal government would govern the economy and diplomacy and defense, which may sound like a short list, but it covers quite a lot, especially given the reach of economic policy. And the states would continue to govern everything else, including deploying the basic police powers that are really most of what government does. This peculiar kind of compound republic, as Madison called it, can let our national politics specialize in some national challenges where we can't avoid the need to decide on one course of action, while the state governments can focus on things nearer at hand in their own different ways. It allows for a diversity of governing approaches to coexist at the same time, even to compete with each other, without having to be resolved into one national approach to every question. This has never been a simple matter, obviously, and in particular, the decision to leave the question of slavery and race up to the states proved to be both wrong and untenable, to put it very mildly. And ultimately, it had to be reversed on the battlefield for the sake of both justice and union. And the 14th Amendment was a kind of reconfiguring of the bargain over federalism. It added the responsibility to apply the laws equally to all citizens, to the roles of the federal government, but otherwise kept in place the fundamental structure of the system so that the rest of the core governing questions, including many divisive questions not as existential as the question of slavery, could be decided differently in different places. Seen through the lens of cohesion, what matters most about federalism is this separation of governing authorities that allows for a genuine diversity in the ends and means of American government. And so that an agenda of federalism reform for us going forward would have to disentangle the states and the federal government somewhat in the areas where we have entangled them to the detriment of how we govern ourselves in education, in welfare, in healthcare, these have created circumstances where no one is really responsible for governing decisions. Look at the Medicaid program, and you see a way to screw up governing on a very, very important arena where the lives of our citizens are really at stake. Thinking about how to fix that has to be a matter of thinking about who's responsible, and therefore how do we allow different approaches to governing to coexist, and how do we balance that with the need to preserve and secure the rights of all of our citizens. Now, those questions that do need to be resolved at the national level are intended first and foremost to be addressed by bargaining in Congress. And the purpose of Congress also is a little different than what you might imagine in light of the Constitution's emphasis on unity. Congress is really at the center of the constitutional system, for good and bad. It is the first branch, not by coincidence. In Federalist 51, Madison says, in Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. And that really contains the reason why Congress is central. Republican government is representative government. And although the presidency and to some extent the courts are ultimately accountable to the people too, only Congress is really designed to be representative of the people. And Congress is, of course, the absolutely central institution in the Constitution's notion of unity too. By representing our plurality, our national legislature can allow for negotiations among the basic factions that compose that plurality. This is the first and foremost way, the most important way, in which the Constitution envisions Americans acting together when we don't think alike, by negotiating toward broadly acceptable courses of action. That is the essence of American politics. When it works, and I stress when it works, Congress can function as an arena of contention and coalition building, and ultimately even of integration, as the representatives of different American points of view oppose each other, are compelled to find ways to accommodate each other, and in some respects ultimately come to understand themselves as engaged in common work together in ways that can reflect back on their divided constituencies. Madison thought this was maybe the primary advantage of representative institutions. They can refine and elevate public sentiments and passions. They can allow the people's representatives to solve problems in ways that the people directly could not have. This is a key reason why Congress is not simply majoritarian. The U.S. Congress is different from the kinds of parliaments that you would find in most of the democracies of the modern world, because it doesn't empower narrow majorities to govern. In most of the world, if you win an election, you have all the power of government until you lose your majority. In the American system, if you win an election, you get a seat at the table with all sorts of people you don't like. And what you have to do at that table is negotiate. Every modern president, every modern congressional leader has found himself sitting across from the people he just beat in the last election and thinking, why am I talking to these people? And the Constitution's answer is because you have to broaden your appeal. You have to broaden your majority. And the character of Congress very much answers to this call, to this need. The distinct and overlapping majorities that elect the House and Senate, the constant threat of presidential vetoes, the supermajority requirements that you find here and there are all ways that prevent narrow temporary majorities from exercising a lot of power and force them to deal with broad, durable minorities, to build some consensus. That is in part to protect minorities. It's also to build consensus that reaches beyond simple majority power, to broaden legitimacy, to make us more unified before we act. That kind of coalition building doesn't often feel unifying as it's happening because negotiating processes inherently are adversarial. You're basically fighting. But what you're really doing is dealing with each other by compelling different factions to deal with each other with the aim of concrete common action. These kinds of processes can forge real common ground. As much as it is a source of public policy, Congress is a source of this kind of accommodation, an arena for working out differences in ways that can disarm dangerous divisions. A system that has a reasonably functional Congress at its center is a system that has this kind of accommodation at its center, and so has the desire and the ability to resolve disputes within a shared framework at its center. Now, needless to say, that is not what Congress generally looks like right now. And so it's not what our political culture looks like. There have been some instances in recent years of genuine cross-partisan bipartisan bargaining over key issues, especially thanks to the filibuster in the Senate, the only reason we've had any bipartisan legislation in the last 15 years. But it's been much too rare. And a lot of the time, the institution is dominated by culture war theatrics and partisan grandstanding. The fact that Congress is broken is a key reason why our political culture is broken. But when we think about how to address that problem, it's very important for us to understand what Congress is meant to do. Everybody agrees Congress is dysfunctional. That's an easy one. But there is not, I think, broad agreement about what function it is now failing to perform. The natural answer to that question, the intuitive answer, might be that it's just not passing big legislation. It's not addressing the big problems. Whatever you think is the chief national problem now, our fiscal challenges or the environment or immigration, I guarantee you Congress is not currently solving that problem. That's true. But underneath that is a more fundamental purpose of the institution that comes into view when we think about the Constitution in terms of national unity. Hope so. Is he all right? All right. Underneath those differences is a more fundamental way to think about the purpose of the institution. If you think that the purpose of Congress is just to pass big legislation, you might tend to think that Congress needs to be more efficient. So you'd want to centralize power in the hands of party leaders. You'd want to make Congress more accountable to the president. You might want to get rid of the filibuster because it slows things down all the time. But if instead you think that the purpose of Congress is to facilitate cross-partisan bargaining and accommodation, then your sense of what's wrong might be different. If that's the purpose, well, that is why we're not passing big legislation, because Congress is failing to facilitate bargaining. But if the purpose is that bargaining, then you want to make Congress less efficient. You want to force members to deal with each other. You want to decentralize power, not so that not just 4 people are making all the policy decisions, but a lot of members with a lot of different kinds of views are involved. You love the filibuster, as I love the filibuster, because it's the only thing that lets us do anything in a bipartisan way. So the diagnosis really matters for prescribing solutions to Congress's challenges. And seeing that the purpose of the institution is to resolve disputes is absolutely essential to understanding what it is now failing to do, and therefore how we might think about improving it. Now, the task of turning Congress's negotiated frameworks into actual functional administration falls to the President of the United States. But the President's role in advancing national unity is also not what we might first imagine that it would be. Some critics of the Constitution who are dissatisfied with how inefficient policymaking by bargaining and accommodation can be often look to the President to act more decisively on behalf of the country. There are also some people, and at any given time the President tends to be one of those people, who argue that our President, because he's the only official who's elected by a national constituency, is also the most representative figure in our politics, the one with a real mandate to speak for the country. But that is completely at odds with how the authors of the Constitution understood the office, and I think with how we should understand it. The presidency is a unitary institution, and so it can't be a venue for accommodation and bargaining. It's one person. It's a locus of action intended both to execute the laws and to respond to demanding kinds of practical challenges. And the framers of the Constitution did not view the presidency as a representative institution. The chief executive is elected to make him accountable. But one person can't be representative of an immense, diverse country. To imagine that one person could represent us is to imagine that we are already unified and that what we lack is representation. But if you see that we're not unified, then you see that to be represented, we need a plural institution, like Congress. The president has an essential role in advancing unity, but it's a different role than the one that Congress is meant to serve. Along with his other essential functions, his core purpose in advancing national unity is to provide a stable backdrop for our national life. Stability, consistency, predictability. It really stands out when you look at how the framers of the Constitution thought about the office. Steadiness is at the center of what they had in mind. Alexander Hamilton again and again describes the presidency in terms of what he calls steady administration. That's the president's distinct contribution to the unity of our society. Stability is essential to social peace. Without it, it's very hard for people to feel secure, to make plans for the future, to take risks, to really engage with other people. Unsteadiness in government makes it very hard for anybody to be a faithful, law-abiding citizen. You just never know what the law is going to be tomorrow. And it is the president, because of his capacity for unitary action and direction, who really bears the greatest responsibility to act with steadiness, to avoid sharp changes of direction, to avoid reversals of course, to keep our government stable and secure. Now, stability is not stasis. It's not standing in place. The president is expected to give a steady direction to our politics, even to some of Congress's work, to set general priorities, to propose some legislative measures, to veto things he disapproves of. But in doing all of that, his chief purpose beyond the defense of the country is to turn Congress's negotiated directives into steady, consistent administrative action. The emphasis of the framers on that just cannot be overstated. And surely you can see how this might be a problem for us now. Here, too, the contemporary constitutional practice that we see from all of our modern presidents of both parties has become totally disconnected from its intended aims. We've come to think of the president as speaking for a party much more than acting for a nation. And changes in party in the White House now lead to a very nasty kind of whiplash, as a new president spends half his time undoing his predecessor's administrative actions and the other half taking all kinds of administrative actions that his successor is going to undo. That obviously undermines the work of steady administration, but it is at least as bad for our society's capacity for unity and civic peace. It vastly increases the stakes of presidential elections, encourages us to see our society as two opposing camps arrayed against each other for control of the instruments of power. It makes it very difficult for us to think in stable ways about the future, because everything seems to be always at stake in presidential elections. Everything could change direction. Reining in the executive, reining in the administrative state is therefore not just a matter of constraining government power. It would offer us a way to recover the capacity of our governing institutions to forge some of the common ground that we lack, and the capacity of our presidents to secure a stable backdrop for American public life. The ways in which we now think about the president's job make it very difficult for us to think of any of our presidents as successful. We set out for them impossible tasks, and they then fail to achieve them, and we think they failed at their job. But what they failed at is not their job. The way they describe their own role is, in fact, very legislative. The president seems to think that his job is to advance the agenda that voters voted for and make it the law. Well, that's the job description of Congress. And as long as we fail to understand the difference and don't really see administration for what it is, it's going to be very, very difficult for our system to function and for our presidents to succeed. And this applies to all of our modern presidents, not just this one or the last one. Finally, the courts are also essential to making greater unity possible, but again, maybe not exactly in the way that we might imagine. The crucial service that they provide on that front is not the resolution of disputes that divide our free society. Obviously, courts do resolve disputes, that's what they do, but they're intended to resolve disputes about what the law is and not what it should be. And so they're not the right venue for mediating among the competing visions of the public good in our society. Our great public disputes over what the law should be need to be resolved through the work of the legislature above all, and in a very different way from how courts resolve disputes. And what the courts then do is make sure that those negotiated frameworks of law are carried out properly and in accordance with the Constitution, so that the most valuable service the courts provide to the cause of national unity is in their policing of the rules and boundaries of constitutionalism. The federal courts have enormous counter-majoritarian power, which makes them inherently dangerous in a republic. It's absolutely crucial that power like that be used to guard the structure of the system, to keep elected officials focused on their proper work. That is a restrained role for courts, but it's also a restraining role. and it's a very difficult role. It's going to matter enormously in the next few years, and playing that part properly is going to require what Alexander Hamilton called in Federalist 78 an uncommon portion of fortitude in the judges to do their duty as faithful guardians of the Constitution. We do need that now, more than usual. The temptation to use the courts to decisively resolve divisive political disputes is obviously enormous, because in court you can just win, and you don't have to deal with those other people. And so if you have a chance to do it, it always is enticing, but it doesn't really work that way. Giving in to that temptation has historically been a terrible mistake. Elite fiats are not a way to resolve divisive differences in our society, whatever that elite might be. They usually only deepen our divisions. The courts have to instead protect the space in which genuine resolution can happen, and especially the space in which Congress can do its work, while also protecting the rights of individuals and of minorities against majority power, as guaranteed in the Constitution. It can do both of those difficult things at once by keeping everyone involved, both public officials and citizens, true to the Constitution and bounded by its structure and its substance. It should prevent end runs around the Constitution, not facilitate them. But of course, end runs now are rampant, and none of the institutions of the system really work quite as they were intended or quite as I've described them here. I think that is in no small part because the Constitution's vision of unity is controversial and always has been. It has been contested from the start. The idea that the Constitution exists to let us act together even when we don't think alike has never really sat easily with some critics of the system. The deepest critiques of it have always been what I would describe as integralist objections to Madisonian pluralism. They argue that the system has to answer to one voice or one vision of the good, or else it can't work. Woodrow Wilson, especially in the years in which he was a political scientist before he became a politician, was in some ways the most articulate and profound of these critics. He made a serious argument. He argued that the framers operated with what he called a Newtonian image of government as a machine, but that in reality, government is more like an organism. And that means that separating powers and setting interests off against each other doesn't make any sense. Everything has to push in the same direction, or else it'll all fall apart. Our system, he said, instead should be organized to respond efficiently to the public will as it's expressed in elections by allowing majorities to govern unimpeded until the public throws them out. In other words, he almost explicitly rejected the idea that it was even possible to act together without thinking alike in politics. The system has to have some unitary aim that it answers to. There are a lot of ways in which contemporary progressivism is integralist in a way like this, insisting that every institution in our society, private and public, has to be engaged in the same social crusade, no exceptions, no exemptions, and implicitly that there really can't be a society without a single comprehensive common project. And there are certainly people on the right today who agree with that, but who would just substitute their own ideology or even just the will of a president they like as the unifying vision that has to guide the social organism in a unitary way. This is not a crazy way to think about how democracies should work. In some ways, the Westminster model, the parliamentary model that you find in a lot of democracies, works this way. It is a legitimate democratic model of government. But it's one that's geared much more to the demands of administration and accountability than to the demands of accommodation and social peace. And Wilson took that kind of model as his goal explicitly. He wasn't blind to the need for unity, but he was, I think, deaf to the logic of building cohesion by representing plurality. Unity, he thought, should be achieved by unitary leadership, and therefore, above all, by the president, who alone had a national mandate to speak for the whole society. This kind of vision points toward dramatically different ways of understanding each of the key institutions that I've just talked about. It has no patience for the havoc and disorder of federalism and wants the system to be ordered by national priorities. It wants a much more disciplined Congress that answers to party leaders, that's accountable to coherent partisan platforms. It wants to substitute orderly administration and adjudication for messy deliberation. It wants the president to stand in for the nation, and it wants the courts to let that happen. And of course, our system has moved in exactly that direction on every one of these fronts for decades now. Congress has become much more centralized and under the thumbs of party leaders. Presidents routinely claim that they alone can speak for the will of the nation. And this has happened under both parties. As a practical matter, for example, I think maybe the most Wilsonian congressional leader in American history was my old boss, Newt Gingrich. It may turn out that the most Wilsonian president since Woodrow Wilson is Donald Trump. But whatever might be said about the administrative and ideological consequences of this kind of counter-Madisonian turn in American constitutional practice, we would surely have to say that it has contributed to making us more divided. It's made our politics more partisan. It's raised the stakes and therefore the temperature of our elections. It's closed off some essential venues for deliberation and accommodation. And so it's left us with fewer tools for fighting polarization and fragmentation. This kind of Wilsonian turn in American constitutionalism is not the only reason that we're divided, obviously. But it is, I think, why we think that our Constitution can't help us address our divisions. Why so many Americans have come to think that the Constitution is a relic with very little to offer us. In reality, the Constitution was designed to address exactly the kind of problem we now face, and it could make a real difference if we let it. Better grasping the presumptions and ambitions that underlie the Madisonian system could help us to see that in our divided moment, the Constitution is much less the problem than the solution, or at least that we need to let the logic of the system better inform our practice of politics. But ultimately, and this is where I want to close, there's an even more fundamental reason why the Wilsonian critique of American constitutionalism doesn't really make sense as a solution to the problems that we have now. That critique, in its different forms, generally argues for a simpler majoritarianism. It says our system is standing in the way of change the public wants, and so it implies that our divisions are just illusions, that we're actually already unified, but that we're denied what we want by a system that is geared to frustrate us. There have certainly been times in our history when something like that may have been true, when the deliberate recalcitrance of the Constitution has been a key problem, when large majorities of Americans expressed a clear set of desires for an extended period of time, but were denied what they wanted by the rigidity of our system. But there have been other times when our biggest problems have been something more like strife and discord, when division has been the challenge we face, when Americans were bitterly divided from each other, viewed one another more as enemies than friends, and so have been unable to form clear, durable, political aspirations beyond just getting rid of their opponents. Times when each of our political parties has told the public that the other party is the country's biggest problem. We are plainly now living in such a time. There is no broad and durable American majority that is advancing a coherent agenda that's somehow obstructed by the slowness of the Constitution. Simple majoritarianism just wouldn't be very useful when we don't have clear majorities for anything. Rather, our politics overflows now with partisan bile. Our problem is not that we aren't expressing our broadly shared aspirations in public policy. Our problem is that we're not forming broadly shared aspirations. That's what we need help with from our system of government. We need help in finding ways to act together even though we don't think alike. That suggests that we're going to need to choose to prioritize cohesion and coalition building, the forging of trust. And to do that, we should begin by recognizing that these are among the original goals of the American Constitution, and that it offers us a lot of tools that are built exactly for achieving those goals. And that today's intense disunity has been driven in part by our broken constitutional practice, which has undermined the means by which we could pursue these constitutional aims. Rather than rush to reshape our institutions in the mold of our worst contemporary civic vices, we should let the structure of our institutions teach us something about what we're doing wrong. We should think about how we might reform our institutions to better achieve their own highest aspirations. That aim suggests not only an agenda for reform, but I think a particular spirit in which we might approach the work of politics now. Citizens who want to see our society grow stronger should approach our institutions in a spirit of repair. informed by a sense of what's missing, what's gone wrong, but inspired by a sense of what's good in what we have and what could serve us well. This moment tempts us to repudiate our inheritance as Americans, but it actually requires us to renew it. Americans are frequently angry at the Constitution now because we sense that it's broken down. But if we could see that we have broken it, then we could see that it needs us if it's going to serve us. By rising to repair it, we could enable it again to repair our society a little, to bring us a little closer together, as it was made to do. The work of healing our divisions has to start by becoming reacquainted with the American Constitution. Thank you.
Time for a few questions.
Yeah, please. I think there's a microphone on the way to you. There you
Hello. Needless to say, I found your words quite compelling. I enjoyed your speech, and thank you for coming here to the Baker School. I'm a student here. I'm a sophomore, and I'd like to ask, you speak a lot in terms of respecting the Constitution, reviving the sort of civic virtue. Do you think that should be done through civic education at the lowest level that would revive the sort of constitutional respect and reform of government that you speak of, or do you think that we need to aim for more institutional reform immediately before such things can happen?
Yeah, thank you. It's a wonderful question. Obviously, the answer is we need both, but I actually think that approaching the challenge we have now by saying that we don't trust our institutions enough isn't quite right. I think the problem we have now is that our institutions are not trustworthy enough. And you can't just tell people trust. That's not how trust works. It has to come from the people seeking to be trusted, right? And so in that sense, certainly, I think civic education is vital. I think it's important that Americans know more about our system, know more about our history, understand the skills involved in the practice of citizenship. All of these things matter immensely. But the challenge of trust fundamentally has to be addressed by people who want to be trusted, acting in ways that make them worthy of trust. And that does have to start with our leaders as much as with any of us. Now, we have to see that we are all, in one way or another, important players in some set of institutions, right? We're not all in Congress, but we're all in a family. Maybe we work somewhere, maybe we go to school somewhere, maybe we have some set of obligations and people who look to us. And we should think about how we might make those institutions more trustworthy by the way we behave. Ask ourselves, given the role that I have here, what should I be doing and what should I not be doing? A lot of what it really means that we've lost trust in our institutions is that we constantly find ourselves now looking at people in positions of authority and thinking, how could that person do that? Right? And they should ask themselves that question, and we should ask ourselves that question. Right? And so I think that suggests that these two ways of solving the problem are connected. Right? We all have a role to play. And certainly learning more about what that role has to involve is important. But actually playing that part properly is also important. We can't use every institution as if it was just a stage for building our personal brand on the internet. That's a way to lose trust. That's exactly what a lot of our politicians do, a lot of our corporate leaders do, all of our leaders do. They have to be formed by the institutions they're part of so that they become a certain kind of person in the world. There is such a thing in the world as a member of Congress, right? Or a dentist or an accountant. That kind of thing is shaped by a set of responsibilities and obligations. It's an expectation people have of you. You talk to somebody for a while and they tell you they're a Marine and you think, yeah, I know you're a Marine. I've been talking to you for 15 minutes. I can see it. What does that really mean? That means you think the Marines shape human beings in a certain way. And in fact, all of our institutions should do that and should understand their purpose as doing that. So I think it's not just about civics education. Obviously, that matters hugely. It's immensely important, and what happens here is enormously important. Nothing else would be possible without it. But there also has to be imbued in us a sense of responsibility that's ultimately where genuine Republican citizenship has to come from. Let's wait for the microphone.
Pardon me, Jake Colden Sharman. I'm I'm a junior. I'm a freshman here. I'm sorry.
Ah.
I get confused. It's been a while since high school. So I guess with the change in the Senate, has that affected federalism because the Senate's no longer elected by the legislator as was intended? So how has that changed federalism since state legislators no longer have a say in Senate elections and how the founders envisioned? How has that changed how the founders envisioned?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I think that there is certainly a way in which the 17th Amendment, which changed the way the Senate is chosen, from having senators in most states chosen by state legislatures to having them elected directly by the public, it certainly made the Senate somewhat more like the House. But I think it's easy to overstate how much of a difference that made. I wouldn't attribute a lot of our problems to the nature of the Senate to begin with, and I wouldn't attribute a lot of our problems to the way the Senate is elected. I think if I were choosing where to direct political reform energy, the 17th Amendment would be very low on the list. There are a lot of other problems to solve. A lot of states had already started having senators elected directly by the time the amendment passed. This is actually something in general to understand about our constitutional amendments. With the exception of the 3 that were ratified after the Civil War, which were really forced on the South, constitutional amendments generally represent very broad public consensus, right? Because in order to pass one, you have to have massive supermajorities, both in Congress and the state legislatures. So they usually speak for a decision that's already been long made by the public by the time they're in the Constitution. And so there are a lot of things I would change about Congress. I don't think that how senators are elected is a big part of what's gone wrong in American federalism or in American constitutionalism. Yeah.
Hey, I'm Jack Dempsey. I'm a freshman here at UT. I guess the main point you're trying to make is like bipartisanship, but how do you address bipartisanship on an interpersonal basis? Like a friend of mine who's a member of a different political party,
Yeah.
or how would you go about addressing that on an interpersonal basis? Because
Yeah.
I feel like that's the basis for all of society.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an enormously important question. And I would say the fact that we find it hard to think about this now is an indication of how bad things are on this front, right? Because we've been living for a while, and younger people have been living their whole lives in a political culture in which engaging with people who disagree with you is kind of a strange thing, and we need help doing it. That is strange. And I think, as a general matter, the tendency to think that what's wrong in America now is that we disagree too much, we're at each other's throats too much, is exactly wrong. We disagree too little. Even very politically engaged people in America spend very little time actually talking to people they don't agree with. Politically engaged people spend all of our time in cocoons with people we agree with, talking about people we disagree with. We have a lot of opinions about them, but they don't know what they are. And they're not going to. All kinds of elements of our political culture now have been built up to allow us to do this. And all kinds of technologies have been built up to allow us to do this. So that if you really want to, you just don't have to actually hear the other side. You just hear a lot of people on your side talk about the other side. And that means that directly engaging with those people seems like a really strange thing to do. I mean, they're so awful, right? I hear all day how awful they are. What do you mean my doctor is one of them? That can't be right. Actually engaging with people who disagree with you is an essential part of living in a free society. And what you learn when you do it is that, yes, they do disagree with you, but they're also kind of normal people. And they're not crazy. They don't think the craziest thing that somebody on their side thinks. Not everybody on the left thinks everything that the craziest people on the left think, and vice versa for the right. The way to learn that is to actually engage with people. I think we need to be disagreeing a lot more, and we need to be engaging with people who disagree with us a lot more than we do, not less than we do, so that it's not so strange, and it's not so difficult and complicated for us. And I would say in general, that as a matter of sort of building civic habits, when we incline to start a sentence about Americans with they, we should change course and say we. And I say this for a particular reason, and I'll tell you a quick story that I tell in this book too. I am an immigrant to the United States. I grew up here, but my family came when I was a young child, and I became an American citizen when I was 19. I took the citizenship oath at the federal courthouse in Newark, New Jersey, which I don't recommend, but putting that aside, it's not the most beautiful place in my adopted homeland. At the end of the really wonderful ceremony that we had, the retired judge who had given us the oath got up to give a little speech. And by then I was a thoroughly assimilated American. I'd grown up here. I was on my way to becoming a political scientist. And so I thought he was going to talk about Lincoln and the founders and something beautiful. And instead he said something pretty strange. He said, from now on, you have to think and speak about America in the first person plural. And I will tell you frankly that I did not know what that meant. I think a lot of new Americans in the room were thinking, did I really pass the English test? He told us. What it meant was you have to speak in terms of we and us and not them and they. Because in the experience of an immigrant, there's a big they out there all the time. And what it means to become an American is to think of this country as we, right? We went to the moon. I didn't go to the moon, but I am part of a we that did that amazing thing. I thought at the time, I frankly left that thinking, what a strange speech to give. But here I am many years later telling you about it because I think it's exactly what we needed to hear. Not just we immigrants in that room, but all of us Americans need to hear that constantly. We is a very, very important word in the American political tradition. If you think about that magical second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, where we learn that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator, how does that paragraph start? It says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, right? How does the Constitution start? It says, we, the people of the United States. That is not a coincidence. These are ways of speaking on behalf of a single society with a shared future and a common fate and taking ownership of it. And we've got to find ways to start more sentences with we. And I do think that has to happen in our own lives as well as in the abstract of our sense of civics.
One more question.
Hi, my name is Kendall Hubbs, and I am a current freshman here at the Baker School majoring in public affairs. You talked a lot about growing conversations and using we within political discussions that we're having. I just was wondering your opinion on the current war on free speech that we're seeing, especially in the wake of the Charlie Kirk shooting, and with how us as a society should be responding to acts of political violence and how we should grow from the war on free speech that we're currently seeing in society.
Thank you. It's a really vital question right now, and I would say it's been an essential question for a long time. The challenges we see to free speech didn't just start, and they don't just come from one side. They generally come from whoever feels like they have power in whatever institution you might be in at any given time. And I think the inclination to think that what it means to have power is to shut up the other side is a very, very dangerous inclination in American political life. And it's clear that it doesn't, that it's not a function of one party and it's not a function of one ideology. It's a risk you run when you seek and have power in our society. And I think we have to learn, again, we can learn it from the Constitution, that ultimately no one can be trusted with power if that is what is going to happen. And we can't have any confidence in the leaders of our society if when they get power, their first decision is to shut up the other side. Now, look, there are boundaries. There are boundaries even in a free society. There are boundaries that especially revolve around the danger of violence. There are boundaries that involve incitement to violence, and I would say even the celebration of violence, which is not an expression of an opinion, really. You're not taking part in a political debate. when you say it's a wonderful thing that someone got shot. So I do think that we have to think about where those boundaries are. It's a hard question. It's a legal question and a moral question and a civic question. And the fact that we wrestle with it, it is simply a function of the fact that it's not a simple matter. And so people with responsibility in important institutions have to constantly wrestle with it. I don't think it's the case that they're obviously wrong in setting the boundary here or there, but we have to see that the reason for the boundary is to protect the space within it, which is a space for the free society to live its life freely. So that we should try to err in the direction of the freedom of expression. That doesn't mean absolutism, and it doesn't mean that there are no lines. It means that when we think about what the lines are, we have to keep in mind the importance of being able to express our views, take part in the civic public life of our society. Ultimately, what we learned, it seems to me, when that murderer did what he did in Utah, is that the only real alternative to the liberal society is violence. That it's it. It's this or that. And so the choice we face when we confront the challenges, the difficulties of living as free people in a free country, we have to recognize that the alternative to that is not a country with everything we've got where we just don't have to hear people we don't like. That's not going to happen. If we give that up, we give everything up. The only real alternative to the kind of difficult, complicated freedom that we're working to sustain is a society in which you answer disagreement with violence, and that has to be unacceptable. We have to be willing to say whatever we think about any particular issue or any particular person, we have to be able to say no to that. Because once we've lost that ability, we've really lost the capacity to sustain this country and to sustain our freedom. And we've lost what we inherited, and we can't pass it on to our children. So it could not be more important that we take that threat seriously, always. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for being here. We have another lecture on October 21st in the Baker School. You can look for that on our website. I want to once again thank our distinguished speaker. I know that you all are rewarded for having been able to hear him tonight. So thank you again for being here. Thank you, Yuval. Okay, you met Rob. Okay, yeah. Thanks for coming on. I think starting off with you guys.
Parsons' book on the Constitution. I read it in the library the other day.
Yeah. Yes.